Welcome to South by Southwest 2021 online. This is the panel about taking sustainable investing mainstream. My name is Suhaila Ofata, and I will be your moderator today. On my day-to-day job, I am with BMW I Ventures, which is the hybrid venture capital fund of the BMW Group. We invest in purpose-driven founders that are tackling the biggest challenges in our industry. Today, I'm surrounded in our panel with great innovators and investors from the sustainability space. Let's start with a brief introduction. Amy, why don't you take it away with an intro?
Sure. Hi, everyone. It's really nice to meet you. I'm Amy Dufour, and I'm a principal at Prime Impact Fund. Prime Impact Fund is an early stage venture capital fund that invests in technology companies with the potential for gigaton scale climate impact. Our whole shtick in our model is that we use structurally patient and flexible capital called catalytic capital to de-risk early stage climate technologies for follow-on investors. And as a principal, I'm responsible for leading investments and sitting on company boards.
So I'm Rob McGinnis. I'm founder and CEO of Prometheus. What we do is remove carbon dioxide from the air and turn it into zero net carbon gasoline and jet fuel.
And I'm Ryan Morris. I'm CEO of Turntide Technologies. We have the most efficient electric motor in the world based around switch reluctance motor technology that is kind of natively digital DNA, so it's intelligent and efficient.
Perfect. So let's get right into the discussion. So our panel is about the topic of taking sustainable investing and sustainable building mainstream. Is that actually already a mainstream topic? And if yes, why? Let's get your opinions on sort of what are the current market conditions that are leading to this development. Amy, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to jump in. So I definitely think sustainable investing is on its way to being mainstream. I think there are a couple of different reasons for that. I think one, if you think around the dramatic declining cost of capital for renewables like solar and wind, which are often the cheaper option and now dominate the new electricity capacity. I think there's also a change in consumer preferences. The generation now is much more conscious about not compromising impact for financial returns, and they believe that they can make money while doing good. They're also putting a lot more pressure on corporations and policymakers to take this into account. And I think maybe the last thing is that in general, we've seen that there's more interest in environmental impact after crises. So we saw that with the 2008 financial crisis. There was a big boom in impact investing. And I think similarly, given that we're in a pandemic, there's also a renewed interest on environmental and social impact. So sustainable investing to me is going mainstream.
So what are other inflectors that you guys see in the overall industry? I know you have a strong background in the renewable energy sector, Amy. Maybe you want to give a little bit more color to this.
Yeah, I mean, I think renewables are interesting. I mean, it's been such a great run for them more broadly. So when you think about the declining costs of capital, that is super, super exciting. I mean, that enables a whole new class of investors to be able to participate. I mean, the big banks are really playing a large role in sort of renewable energy development. And I think that means that the next wave of sustainable investing is going to be sort of outside of solar and wind, and it's thinking around sort of battery technologies to enable intermittent renewables to be more on demand. Or when we think about electric vehicles, like what's really the next frontier? So I'm really excited about it.
So we kind of heard that there's a kind of a perfect storm right now with changing consumer mindset, with increasing regulations, and actually corporates now also moving into the space and demanding sustainable technologies. I'd love to hear from Rob and Ryan what your experience has been with your companies. Is there actually a hype? Are investors lining up to invest in your businesses? And what has been your experience so far in your fundraising processes?
I can go first. So I think just on the topic of, why now, there's a motto I kind of like to live by from Charlie Munger that is, all I want to know in life is just tell me where I'm going to die and then I'll just not go there. So I think the world has woken up to the idea that if you don't have a lot of capital going into fund sustainability, we're toast. So I think that awareness has been driving it. And I would say that's the cost of capital side of the equation that Amy mentioned. But the other thing that's a maybe more fundamental driver is this exponential technology dynamic that, obviously is, from Moore's Law and microprocessor industry, but the cost curve for a lot of these technologies, whether it's LED lights, solar batteries, in our case for motors and power electronics, software, simulation-based design, this is really enabling an explosion of new capabilities that just weren't feasible before. So, I mean, we've been oversubscribed in every fundraise that we've done. It certainly wasn't easy in the early years. Actually, some of our, I had sold a previous company in electric vehicles and self-funded a lot of the early days of Turntide when, frankly, nobody believed in it, 3 or 4 years ago, because it was still in the winter of clean tech 1.0. But, the last 6 to 12 months, I would say that the tide is very much changing on that.
And Ryan, so when we look at Turntide, we actually see a company with a great technology. You tackle basically all of the inefficiencies that exist with existing motors out there. Maybe you want to give us a bit more background on sort of what the company does and what your vision was, and sort of where you're going next with your company.
Yeah, the interesting thing, I worked in electric vehicles, and I had assumed electric motors were this sort of solved, uninteresting problem. And it turns out that half the electricity in the entire planet is consumed by electric motors. Every fan, pump, obviously vehicle traction is a rapidly growing segment. And the pretty shocking thing is something like 95% plus of those motors are, it's called an AC induction motor architecture that Nikola Tesla invented in 1888. So it's one of the largest, least changed markets. And probably half of that $1 trillion is wasted between inefficiency and ineffectiveness. And so the seed of the idea for our company was around this concept of a switched reluctance motor. That's an old concept, but you could think of it as it's like the first time that you can harness Moore's Law and compute power for a motor architecture. It's very simple mechanically, but it's very hard to control. And every other high efficiency motor needs permanent magnets, so it's a materials or mechanical domain problem. So that was what we set out to do originally, and we solved it, and we're growing quite rapidly. Department of Energy really steered us into upgrading HVAC systems and smart buildings. Our 3 verticals today are smart buildings, sustainable agriculture, and we're just getting into electric vehicle drivetrains now.
Super interesting. And sort of what has been your experience? Maybe you can share with us, what was the importance of strategic partners on the investment side? Sort of, you said the early days you had to fund the company. I know you have a lot of very prominent investors as well, but I'd like to sort of get your perspective on the need of having a strategic partner that can actually help you to tap into a specific vertical if you are poised to disrupt a certain industry.
The thing about motors or lots of other things in clean tech or climate tech, they're not consumer products often. So a motor is always part of a bigger system, and that thing has to work. There's no such thing as like a bad restaurant meal version of a motor or something. Like it's got to work, and it's got to last for like 10 years. And so strategic investors for us, like BMW, like Amazon, like JLL, have been super helpful for helping us break into new markets. JLL for facility managers, BMW for some of the manufacturing applications in long-term vehicle traction, but manufacturing in more the short term. So that it's been, in our case, we've really sought out to partner with strategics that can help serve as the initial customers to prove it that it's feasible. Because that first customer with hard tech is order of magnitude harder than the number 2. It's quite different than consumer.
Absolutely. So I'd like to bring in Rob and your perspective on Prometheus. With your company, you are literally taking CO2 from the air, and within a chemical process, you are transforming this into zero net gasoline. So there are a lot of carbon capture technologies out there, but I know that you have a very special recipe to make this actually work at a very efficient level where you can actually compete. I'd love to hear a little bit more about the vision of the company, why you founded it, what the company is about, and then also specifically hearing about your funding strategy.
Yeah, I mean, speaking to your earlier questions of what are the long-term sustainability changes that have caused this to be a good place to be today, I think the number one thing I think of is the drop in the cost of solar and wind electricity. So the other panelists have talked about the cost of capital, but what that ends up turning into in terms of energy is that now solar and wind power can be less expensive than other sources. And it's so inexpensive now that I think a lot of people have been thinking, how can I turn this solar and wind energy into all the goods and services we used to get from fossil fuels? And so the reason we exist is to turn that solar and wind power into gasoline and jet fuel that are essentially electric fuels and replace fossil fuels. But in order to do that, you have to recognize that these fuels are commodities. And even though people would very much like to buy a zero net carbon version of these things, the willingness to pay additional costs is relatively modest still. I'd say most people, 10 cents, 15 cents a gallon, and they really can't afford to go much above that, above the price of, say, fossil, regular unleaded. So our philosophy is that we have to be able to compete on price in order to approach this solution to this problem. So the main idea is to use entirely electrical energy, to not use any thermal energy. Most of the people who've looked at direct air capture of carbon dioxide have tried to use a thermal process to try and desorb CO2 that has been adsorbed onto something like a adsorbent, which is solid or liquid. And so we don't do that. We have an integrated carbon dioxide capture process that is entirely electrical and that can turn on and off really quickly in a way that matches the intermittent availability of solar and wind power. And so these things, together with a few other innovations along the same line, allow us to essentially turn CO2 into gasoline and jet fuel in water at room temperature using electrochemistry. And our approach is that we're going to sell the gasoline to consumers directly. To Ryan's point, it's very difficult to do a business-to-business sale for a new technology which is intended to be sustainable, because most of the primary drivers in that sort of ecosystem are costs alone. Whereas if you can offer, one of the rules of startups is offer something that people want, but it usually has to be a product which is dramatically better than what they now have available. And so an example of that would be, say, Impossible Foods, where they say, well, you can have a burger, which is really harmful for the planet and for yourself, or you can have this pea protein burger, which tastes the same performance, same price, but it's much better. And that difference in people's minds causes them to want to adopt that new product. And for us, the same thing. You can have the gasoline that you've been buying that is destroying the planet around you and under your feet, or you can have this other gasoline, which is higher performance, same price, but it doesn't actually have to cause that problem. And so that big difference in perception of the quality, the value of the product can be very meaningful, but only if you can actually compete on price. And I think that's what differentiates Prometheus from other companies that have looked at direct air capture of carbon dioxide and talked about just sort of putting it in the ground as sort of like a trash collection service.
This is an incredible vision. It must have been tough for you in the first conversations you had with potential investors to convince them that this is actually doable at scale at the same price. Mm-hmm. So maybe you want to share with with our audience your experience. Sort of, what was the type of capital that you tapped into first? Did you, like Ryan, self-funded the company for the beginning? Let us a little bit know what your strategy was on the funding side.
Well, this one's a little unique because I knew that technically I could probably approach this problem for a few years. But I didn't really think in 2017, 2018, that this is something you could fund as a startup. This is something people would want to support. It seemed like everything was, apps and social media. And so when I saw the request for startups from Y Combinator, that really gave me a timing signal that said, this is something you could do now. You can get funded now. And so when I applied to Y Combinator with Prometheus, got in, which itself is very difficult. It's a very low acceptance rate. But you only have 3 months. And in that time, you have a very limited amount of resources, and you have to be able to build something and demo it. And I knew that during that time, I could build a fuel-making device that could pull CO2 from the air and turn it into fuel. And so that's what I did. And the Y Combinator ecosystem is very much about make something people want, clear, concise message, and it was very helpful. And in demo day, we already had half the funding we wanted to raise before demo day started and closed the rest in less than a week. So it was a very enthusiastic community of people who've had a lot of success because they took risks and were successful in startups. So it's a thriving angel ecosystem. It's part of what makes Silicon Valley special. And they were able to understand what you're trying to do and why we thought we could do it. It's a very technical group of people, and so you can make a good technical argument, and they can tell if they think it's sound or not. And so we raised money really successfully. And then we started demonstrating our technology last year, and we had BMW come in and take a look at what we were doing, BMW iVentures, and they immediately thought this was fantastic for drivers, right? People who have cars that they don't want to necessarily trade in for electrics, or maybe they do want to have an electric car, but they want to keep driving a classic car with an internal combustion engine, but they want the option to have that be zero net carbon. So it was a perfect fit. And so that we had funding led by BMW iVentures last year. And so the fundraising has actually not been difficult for Prometheus. There's been a lot of enthusiasm for it. I think as we go forward, if we're going to replace, all the fossil fuel in a $2 trillion economy, we're obviously going to have to raise more capital than we have. But it looks like it's a very, I'd say the climate tech is what a lot of people are calling it now, is hot. So I don't think that's problematic.
It's definitely hot, and that's why we're having the panel about it going mainstream. So I'd like to bring in Amy and maybe get your opinion for, you both are obviously very successful founders and succeeded in building great companies. But for the early stage founders that might be listening into this panel, what are the different types of patient capital or catalytical capital that founders that are intending to build a sustainable company can tap into?
Yeah, it's a great question. So in general, in the sustainable investing space, there are different sources of capital. Could be venture capital, private equity or growth equity, infrastructure, debt. One of the things that we really believe is that there are different colors of capital to support different stages of a company's life cycle or achieve different goals. So at Prime, I mentioned before that it's an early stage venture capital fund, and we typically invest at the earliest stages in hardware-based climate tech companies. I think particularly for these companies, they're more capital intensive, they require a longer investing horizon. And so we think a lot about what is the right color of capital that can support these companies. And at Prime, we use catalytic capital, which is structurally more patient and flexible to primarily support these, hard tech, climate tech companies at the earliest stages. So essentially, we use the capital to de-risk early stage climate technologies. And I think if you believe that deep decarbonization includes both hardware and software-based solutions, but oftentimes, conventional venture investors shy away from hardware because, look, it's hard. I'm glad that Rob and Ryan have had such positive experiences. It hasn't been the same for everyone. That's where we really want to step in and be hands-on partners to companies and really help them achieve particular proof points with our catalytic capital that allows them to become more attractive to follow-on investors. So actually, there's a good example from our portfolio called Lilac Solutions. Lilac is a lithium extraction company. It's really critical for the exponential growth in the electric vehicle market. And we invested in Lilac as our first investment in late 2018. We did $800K. The board was just Prime and the CEO. And over 16 months, we worked with the team on storytelling, team building. They signed several commercial agreements. And then earlier last year, they raised a $20 million oversubscribed Series A round that was co-led by Breakthrough Energy Ventures, the billionaire-backed fund with Bill Gates and Jack Ma and Jeff Bezos, and the Engine, which is MIT's tough tech fund. So that's really an example of the playbook that we just want to do over and over again, and how we believe that catalytic capital can be really critical in de-risking these climate tech companies for follow-on investors.
What is your perspective on having a diverse group of investors on the table? Investors that are very experienced in the impact space, probably have a very thorough way to measure impact, and more traditional or institutional investors that are new to the game, that actually understand that there's a huge development and that there are great companies that need to be funded in the space, but sort of have a very different approach about what they would determine as value and how they manage their portfolio companies.
Another, really helpful question. So we strongly believe in syndicates. I mean, we don't want to go it alone. We think that, out of the 11 companies that we've invested in, only one we've done solo. We kind of think that's hazardous to your health. It's really important to bring complementary skill sets around the table. I think a good example that I can give is with one of our portfolio companies called Clean Crop Technologies. It's an ag tech company that's a really crop loss and food waste play. At Prime, we are climate tech generalists because we look at lots of different technologies. And so when we were making this ag tech investment, we thought, okay, this company is targeting both developed and developing country markets. We are based in Massachusetts. We primarily invest in North American countries, or companies that are based in North America. So it would be really important to get an investor around the table that has experience in developing country markets. So we brought in an investor called Factory Ventures. We are not exclusively ag tech specialists. So when we thought about bringing the syndicate together, we also took a look at two ag tech focused funds called Innova Memphis, and then also Bread and Butter Ventures. So we think that together, with us being really climate focused, with an organization that really focuses on developing countries, and then also ag tech specialists, this is really the right group of people that can help a company go to the next level. And we try to be really intentional about that with every investment. We really want to be thoughtful about building diverse and complementary skill sets and syndicates.
I would very much appreciate everyone's perspective. I mean, we're recording this right now. By the way, this is pre-recorded. Let's hope the world still is the same in a couple of weeks as it is now. I'm sitting here in Germany. You are all US based. And when we look at Europe versus the US and climate, regulations, the Green New Deal that was put in place here in Europe, we recently saw with the Trump administration that there was a lot of pushback leaving the Paris Climate Agreement. Is there sort of a development that you see in the startup space where new founders are now saying, well, now we're going to build, because we see that with the new administration, there's a lot more focus on this space. And actually, is there a kind of a catch-up play between the different geographies, or how would you sort of see the space overall?
So it's kind of a bubble compared to the rest of the US. I don't think they ever slowed down here on the climate regulations. I mean, personally, I think the role of government here is to keep raising the playing field, not to necessarily subsidize any particular technologies, but to make it so that you can have all the entrepreneurs and free markets step in, which is what's totally different this time about kind of climate tech versus clean tech 1.0 12 years ago, is these things are actually economic. But sometimes you need the government to step in with better, more intelligent regulation to raise the playing field, like on fuel economy standards, for example, so that it drives that demand and gets rid of some of the agency costs. So you need it to be clear that if somebody's going to go build something that dramatically improves efficiency, that benefit is going to actually get implemented, versus if you have somebody building a building and they don't pay the electricity bill, you can have issues with that. But yeah, I mean, for sure, the change, I mean, thank God for what happened over the last 3 months. I mean, that's a big step forward for this whole sector.
Well, with having said this, maybe as a final question to wrap up the panel, are there specific advice that maybe our two founders could give to early stage startups listening in around building their value proposition in the sustainability space to be appealing to all type of investors? As we heard from Amy, that this is critical to grow the company. So what is the advice that you would be sharing, maybe with a younger version of yourself even?
Yeah, I can speak to that. You have to do a combination of demonstration and argument whenever you're building a startup company. So you have to demonstrate that you can do the things you're talking about doing well enough, or that you're going to be able to with a certain amount of time and resource. But you also have to make an argument for why you should exist, why what you're doing is actually part of the solution and not sort of part of the problem. You have to some degree, and this is something that takes a while to learn as an entrepreneur, you have to kind of create the reality you're trying to make true. And so, the entrepreneur is always looking forward and saying, this is the way I think the world should be or could be. And if not for our company, it won't be that. And so I have to start talking about that reality and making it true. And so you have to find people along the way who think that you're right, or you could be right about that future. And you have to get them to kind of join you. And that could be an investor, that could be a partner, or that could be employees, or it could be nonprofits. But you have to sort of build a coalition of people who are willing to share your vision of that future reality, that future good you're trying to achieve. And so a huge part of being a founder is not just being in the lab or in the shop and building things, because you have to do that, but it's out communicating the future you're trying to make true. And I think that a lot of scientific sort of origin founders, people are coming out of their PhDs, they're so focused on the data because they're used to that data sort of grant reporting cycle that they forget they sometimes have to go out and they have to evangelize for reality.
Yeah, if you're somebody who needs instant gratification, don't start a climate tech startup. It's there is no greatness without intense discomfort and pain crossing a desert. In this space, these are very hard problems that haven't been solved yet for a reason. There's huge tailwinds. I mean, huge and accelerating tailwinds. So now is absolutely the time to start focusing on it. But you need to really, really have that clarity and commitment to that long-term vision, both to get others engaged, whether it's investors or, frankly, the most important thing is recruiting the best people for your team. I think there's a magnetic attraction to this space now for some of the best people who are really looking for more purpose. I mean, the number of people we've hired from some of these sort of big legacy companies who have incredibly lucrative offers, and they join us because it's like, hey, I really want to be around people that energize me and working on a mission. And so that's so critical for building your team, because that's ultimately how these things are going to get solved. You have some capital, great, amazing people, and hopefully standing on some first principles, good physics, and whatever you're working on. And, that iterated over time for 5 to 10 years is going to cause a great outcome, but it's never easy.
I'd like to add one more thing, if that's all right.
Absolutely.
Is really thinking about this space is getting so hot, is that sort of impact measurement, management, and being able to communicate the climate or sustainable investing proposition is really important. And so we've been asking people to really get smarter on metrics. Like, do you have a sense? I think particularly if we hone in on sustainable investing and look at climate in terms of what your greenhouse gas emissions reduction, can you really put numbers and data around that? I also think that is a much more compelling narrative to make, particularly when you have a lot of new investors or more seasoned investors pouring into the sustainable investing space who are going to care about that, because they will either want to report that to the LPs or be able to really talk through the demonstrable climate impact that their portfolio companies are having. So that's just one other suggestion I would ask startup companies to think about.
That's actually a really important point, Amy. Do you have a couple of great resources that you would like to lead startups to, such as the impact measurement program, or any other resources for tapping into a better understanding of what are the right KPIs to report on?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there are sort of reporting standards called IRIS metrics, IRIS, it's a huge taxonomy. So it's not just environmental, it's also social kind of impact metrics, which can be really helpful when you want to start thinking about what are the things I want to track. There's also a tool called CRANE, which stands for Carbon Reduction Assessment of New Enterprises. Full disclosure, Prime is one of the partners that helped develop that. And that really is an open source public tool, which allows people, both investors and startups, to really do a pulse check on what their greenhouse gas emissions reduction is. So you can sort of go in, play around with a particular sector, kind of look at different parameters, whether it's deployment year or market share, or even thinking about other technologies that could come in and displace. And I think, again, that's like a good sort of starter for 10 to get a sense of how to assess different climate technologies.
Amazing. Thank you all for joining us on our panel, Taking Sustainable Investing Mainstream. I hope you enjoyed this conversation just as much as I did and took away valuable insights. Enjoy the rest of your experience at South by Southwest 2021.